Okay, welcome class to the first of these video lectures. Hopefully this will work. I think this is going to be working better than the live streaming just because I feel like most students would just not even show up after a week to that and just kind of watch the recordings afterwards, which is fine. So rather than, waste everyone's time, let's just kind of do this. So I imagine these lectures will be probably about 30 minutes long, maybe a little shorter, maybe a little longer. But nevertheless, that's the main point, is to just be able to really effectively teach you in the way that I know best. So just a couple of things right off the bat before we get started. One is that the way that these are going to work is that I'm going to go through the lecture and talk like normal and present questions, and you're going to have to listen, write down the question and answer the question, like type it up and put it on Turnitin. Everything during this whole pandemic thing is going to be due on Turnitin. Not a single thing is to be emailed to me. Not a single thing is to be put on the Google Classroom. Everything is going to be on Turnitin. And so one way to check when things are due is to check the Turnitin. But I've decided to also add a master calendar where I've said what day it is, what assignment we're doing that day, and when's it due. And most assignments are going to be due the same day. Um, I made the assignment yesterday due a little later because I just want to make sure we all are on the same page. We're all kind of getting track with this. There are some students who have not reached out to me, so I'm not sure if they're following along or not. But this is going to be hard. So let's just all try and stick together. If you have any questions, I would really, really prefer you not do not comment on the Google Classroom. I don't get notifications for that. I've been trying to figure out how to do that, and it doesn't seem like I can do it. It works way, way better if you email me because I get a notification on my phone and I practically almost immediately answer it, or at least I try to. Um, I would, and also it saves confusion for other students. Sometimes the questions you ask are specific to you. Sometimes the questions you ask are time specific. So just email me rather than comment on the Google Classroom. So email me and I will answer all of your questions. That being said, so we're about to just go through the lecture, and I'll have four questions, maybe some more, maybe some less, but I'll have about four questions that I want you to answer, and I will say explicitly, this is a question that you need to answer. So here we go. We're actually going to start with a little bit before. We're going to start with the Civil Rights Act of '57. So just for a little context here, the governor of Arkansas actually had ordered that for schools to remain segregated, and he had put in the local National Guard to stop blacks from entering into the Little Rock High School. Eisenhower actually overturns that. He sends in troops to actually escort, you can see them here, escort black citizens up into Little Rock High School, and that they would remain there for the entire school year because they were that concerned with violence and protest from the white students there. And in this, I just wanted to reference, I guess would be the best word, the same issue that Byrd had, but on a much smaller scale. Byrd also had in 1970 threats of violence, and so police were on campus the day that Byrd finally desegregated. So that's just kind of harken back to that, and this what leads us to the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Essentially, it does a bunch of things, right? But we need to talk about whether or not those things were themselves um, actually effective. So yes, it banned intimidation and coercion of voting. So what that means is it banned standing outside of a polling booth. The KKK would often intimidate black voters by kind of saying this is our this is our polling booth and you don't want to come here. So it banned that. It established the Commission on Civil Rights as a kind of a government commission, which is there to investigate different issues, and established an Attorney General for civil rights. And an Attorney General is the guy who actually, he's the prosecutor for the state. So like in any court case, you need a prosecution, you need a defense. The United States has a prosecution. And here we are, we're establishing an Assistant Attorney General for specifically civil rights. But the important thing about this is not that it actually got everything done. It's not like 1957 rolls around and boom ushers in this period of racial equality. No, no, it's that establishes the de jure, right? The de jure um, civil rights, even if de facto we're still far away from that. And I think you can make a real argument that what's important about this is not even really did it actually accomplish what it set out to do. Rather, it's that it says that the government is at least on the side of this. And so when we think about how society moves, oftentimes it is what I was saying at the beginning of the school year. We put the agency on something. We put who is doing the action, who is the one pushing the history forward. Is it the government? Is it society? Is it the people? Is it women? Is it blacks? Is it whites? Is it whatever? You can make some group and say these are the people who are really we should focus on, right? Because they're the ones that this story is about. And in here, at least in the early civil rights period, you see a kind of dualism between the government is pushing for things. I mean, this is the Civil Rights Act 1957. The society is not really jiving with this. I mean, most people are rejecting this, as seen from the fact that Burr doesn't desegregate until 16 years after Brown v. Board. Because that's just how it is. People they don't really care what the government has to say. I'm sure living in Louisiana, we can all figure that out. But nevertheless, there's a kind of dualism between the government doing things and then the actual blacks at the bottom, like the actual like civil rights leaders. They're the ones also pushing for things. So there's a kind of dual front here between who's doing the actions. It's the government and it's the people, and it's just slow baby steps. So that's 57. So you're gonna have to know what 57 does. This is the big one. This is the big fish here. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so here we go. In 1961, the core leader, James Farmer, what he does is he has these things called Freedom Riders, where he tries to get Americans from across the country to ride down to the South, and there they will help out with the bus boycotts. This leads to violence, and this is what leads to JFK kind of struggling to react. So what we watched yesterday, that was JFK providing a kind of address to the nation after a result of violence. But these Freedom Riders, yes, you notice here that they're whites, they're blacks, they're people from across the country trying to go all the way down to the South, to like Montgomery, to Alabama, to help out with the bus boycotts that we talked a little bit about during the Eyes on the Prize documentary. Okay, but here's Kennedy. This is Kennedy. This is Richard Nixon. I'm not sure if you can see the mouse. Can you see that? Yeah, there it is. Okay, that's Richard Nixon. That's John F. Kennedy. Anyway, here's what John F. Kennedy does. During his presidential campaign, he actually argues for civil rights. Okay, he's not the most vocal proponent, but he does that thing that politicians do, where they like to stir up the people, and then when in office, by virtue of being a negotiator, a compromiser, I mean, you've got to kind of tone it down. So notice how, Donald Trump would talk about like, oh, we're going to build a wall. It's going to be so much higher. And then through the very nature of being a president, you have to compromise. You have to get things passed. So the wall became, what it is. Similarly, if, let's just assume Bernie Sanders wins the presidency, some far off future. Then from that, I mean, obviously not everything he says is going to get passed. You have to compromise. So it's just, I mean, that's just a kind of rule of thumb here about presidencies, about really just politics, that President Kennedy was, he's saying a bunch of stuff during the 1960 election, but when he becomes in office, he's a little cautious, because the thing is that, remember, at this time we're still dealing with that fundamental issue of poverty. And so if Kennedy wants to get all of his stuff passed, especially his economic stuff passed, he's going to have to avoid alienating Southern Democrats, right? He's going to have to avoid alienating a lot of these Southern representatives and senators who he wants on his side. So if he starts pushing himself as, oh, I'm the civil rights candidate, I'm the civil rights president, even on stuff that everyone can agree on, they're not going to support Kennedy because they see him as the enemy in terms of integration. So yeah, that's why Kennedy is he has to be cautious because he's dealing with a lot of stuff on his plate. You know, he's dealing with Cuban Missile Crisis, he's dealing with segregation, and he's dealing with poverty. So Kennedy kind of inherits a really, really kind of bad America. But what he does is he appoints his brother, Bobby Kennedy, Robert, and this has come up in a few classes. But anyway, Bob is short for Robert. In Old English, people would typically make the names rhyme. So Rob, Bob. I'm trying to think of what else. So Rick and Dick, Richard. That's why Richard Nixon is called Tricky Dick sometimes. Anyway, so Kennedy orders his brother Bobby Robert Kennedy to try to help African Americans here to vote. So here he is with Martin Luther King Jr. Also, Kennedy orders the Interstate Commerce Commission to increase regulations against segregation, trying to stop regulations. And this is the interesting thing here. The Constitution actually gives the power to the government to regulate interstate commerce. And that's just a way of trying to say that the government can create one federal currency. It's to stop states from putting tariffs on each other. To try to create one more union. And here Kennedy is using that clause to fight against segregation, which I think is very good. Nevertheless, it is a kind of I would say loose interpretation of the Constitution, but that's kind of what you have to do here. I mean, you have to interpret it loosely in order to get something that you think good passed, like fighting against segregation. So here's question one. Question one. This is the first question you have to answer. What specifically does John F. Kennedy do for civil rights? So, question again. What specifically does John F. Kennedy do to fight for civil rights? So, that's the first question. All right, here we go. So something else he does. Well, in 1962, so it's the year before he's assassinated, before Kennedy's assassinated. James Meredith, he tries to register at the University of Mississippi, but the governor actually blocks him, and he orders 500 federal marshals. I'm sorry. The governor blocks Meredith from registering at the University of Mississippi. Kennedy orders 500 federal marshals to actually allow Meredith to enroll in campus. And a whole riot actually breaks out. So the main thing to take away from this, I mean, this is the point here, is that not everybody is on board with this. I mean, usually we think of college campuses as being liberal. We think of universities and professors and students as being more left-leaning, more idealistic, more Marxist, if you want to use that language. But that's not necessarily true here in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you see a war over culture, over what America is to stand for. That's why we call this period the culture wars. And I think that that's very appropriate as it evokes the kind of language of conflict. Because here you have students fighting for integration and against it, right? That's the thing is this is in fact my grandparents' generation. 1962 here. Let's see. I think my grandfather was graduating college. I think in about 3 years. Yeah, 1965. So that's the thing is that these people that fought both for and against segregation they're still alive. I mean that's how close this historical event, this historical time period, really is to us. So the Army sends in. At this point, we see Martin Luther King Jr. becoming frustrated with the entire movement. Martin Luther King Jr. remember famously advocates for a kind of pacifist approach, but that's not to say that he argues for a non-existent approach. I mean, he's not saying, well, let's just roll over and take it. He's definitely not saying turn the other cheek. No, he's arguing for action, for clear, demonstrable action, but not through violence, through protest. Through the word here is solidarity, right? Solidarity meaning kind of sticking together forming one front. You think of unions as trying for solidarity. You think of armies wanting solidarity. So in any case, King was jailed after holding some protests, some demonstrations in Alabama. This is where he writes letters from a Birmingham jail. Very, very famous work. Probably one of the greatest works in American literature. I would say, at least it's usually included. But here's the main problem. As Cuban Missile Crisis escalates, Kennedy has to move his attention away from all of this kind of domestic stuff and onto foreign policy, right? And you see this all the time. George Bush came in office. One of the first things he starts talking about, he does not talk about 9/11. No, that's 2001. This is still 2000. He doesn't talk about terrorism or Osama bin Laden or Iraq or Afghanistan. No. George Bush, the famous war on terror president, he starts talking about stem cell research because George Bush is inheriting the kind of luxuries of the 90s, and he's trying to just continue the prosperity felt under Bill Clinton. And so he thinks of himself as a domestic policy president. But how quickly would that be forced away from him, right? George Bush wanted to be a domestic policy president, but he became a foreign policy president. Likewise, Obama wants to end the war on terror. He comes in office wanting to pull troops out of Afghanistan, yada, yada. But he's forced to be a domestic policy president. We're dealing with the 2008 financial crash. We're dealing with the housing mortgage, kind of the bubble bursting, as it were. So you see oftentimes presidents come in with a certain agenda, like they want something. Like Obama was, I think, clearly a foreign policy president, but he was forced to be a domestic policy president. Likewise, Bush wanted to be a domestic policy, but he was forced to be a foreign policy. Kennedy was kind of towing the line between both. I mean, Kennedy wanted, remember, he's talking about that missile gap. He's talking about wanting to arm us with nuclear weapons in order to fight back against the Soviets. Here we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. But also Kennedy was talking about civil rights. So Kennedy was trying to play the whole game. And as the Cuban Missile Crisis escalates, it's not clear that he can focus on so many things at one time. He's playing a very delicate juggling act. But nevertheless, we still get to the Civil Rights Act. So Alabama Governor George Wallace, he blocked African Americans registering for college, and Kennedy appears on television to announce a new civil rights bill to combat this. MLK, the reason why we have the "I Have a Dream" speech, it is to push forward this bill. It's to push forward this bill to try to stop governors from banning African Americans. So the main point of the Civil Rights Act of '64 is to try to get African Americans in college. And that's one of the great keys here is I think that Martin Luther King Jr. inheriting the same thoughts, the same feelings as Booker T. Washington, this idea of education being the key to success, education being the key towards economic prosperity, and economic prosperity being the key towards liberty, I guess, if you want to call it that way. And so we have one clear idea here, one clear kind of philosophy, if you want to call it that way, that the key to success is education. And when we say success, what we really mean is a kind of securing of rights. That if you want to be a first-class citizen, or if you want to have the full protections of the Constitution, you have to be learned enough to fight for it. You have to know what it is that you are owed. And I think that's very, very important, because if we go back to the documentary, there was that black man, I think his name was Joseph, was talking about how he had believed that blacks were inferior. He's a black man, but he believed it because he didn't know any better, because he had grown up in a society which taught him that, and so he just kind of took it for granted. And so education kind of, it opens the mind towards reality or truth in itself. Not just the social reality, not just the world you've inherited, but the world as it ought to be. And I've heard this referred to as the vera mundus, the true earth, the true reality. And I think that's kind of what MLK is arguing for here. That's kind of his philosophical position here, is that if you want to get blacks to rise up, you can't do it through militancy. You can't do it through violence or war, um, because then at that point it just boils down to a numbers game, and that's not what African Americans. They do not have numbers on their side. What they have though is they have the truth on their side, the truth of they are not inferior, and so I think that's what Martin Luther King Jr. is trying to do. Is he's trying to um, essentially play his hand correctly. The hand he's been dealt is not one of power, rather it's one of truth. And that's why I think it takes a reverend, very important figure, a reverend, a doctor, in order to kind of evoke this message. So on August 28th, 1963, he leads 200,000 people onto the nation capital. There you can see in the background, this is the Washington Monument. This is the mirror. And then the Lincoln Memorial's back here. So he's standing, and here's the crowd kind of on either side of him. And this is the "I Have a Dream" speech. We'll watch it later, but famous speech. And it actually gets passed. The Civil Rights Act of 64. Kennedy was assassinated, right, in 1963. He's assassinated. And President Johnson, who himself was kind of a closet racist, still committed himself to passing Kennedy's program. The whole shebang here. What it does is it gives federal government broad power to stop racial discrimination, meaning it really expands the government's ability to affect state laws. At this point, segregation was not a federal issue, it's a state issue. What the Civil Rights Act does is it makes it a federal issue so the federal government can fight against it. It also allowed for, because now there's an act here, you could essentially be violating that act. So what it does is it allows a kind of new brand of lawsuits to emerge about school segregation, kind of building off of the framework built by Brown v. Board, and then also requires employers to stop discrimination in the workplace. So before we get to Malcolm X, here's the second question. Second question is, do you agree with Martin Luther King Jr.? Okay, so here's I think the best argument for Martin Luther King and the best argument against Martin Luther King Jr. Because the best argument for Martin Luther King Jr., or rather the best argument against it, is that, okay, you can talk about ideals, you can talk about truth, but what happens whenever you're going up against an enemy, you're going up against a group of people who themselves don't care, right? What happens when you go up to a group of people who don't care what it is you have to say? That's not the point. For a lot of whites in the South, it was not about truth. It was about power, about maintaining power through fear. And so the kind of pacifist approach, while it might be theoretically coherent, it might be theoretically intact, nevertheless might fail in actually achieving what you set out to do, because the world boils down to power, at least as some people would claim it. I mean, remember that oftentimes we're talking about one view of history is the kind of victor approach. That history is written by the victors. Only those who live get to write the tale of the battle. So, whenever Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, that's such a clear, I think, image of a man talking about peace. Martin Luther King Jr. never killed a man, but yet he invited that kind of violence because his enemy is a violent enemy and not one to be reasoned with. So the best argument against Martin Luther King Jr. and kind of in support of someone like Malcolm X is he's not talking about going out and just killing people who oppose you. Rather, it's to take a kind of more aggressive approach to get things done. Because the pacifistic approach, that Malcolm, this is what Malcolm X critiques, is the pacifistic approach might not necessarily get you everything you want to get, because it's kind of turning the other cheek. It's very slow. It's not as quick, and yet the dangers that blacks are facing here are very quick. I mean, think about Emmett Till being murdered. He's a 14-year-old boy. You can't let that kind of thing happen again. So you can't necessarily wait on this kind of slow-moving but idealistic kind of approach of Martin Luther King. So the argument against him would be Malcolm X. So Malcolm X argues rather that you're going to have to fight for your rights, because it boils down to power. So Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. both agree they have the truth on their side. They have the truth of human dignity on their side. Where they differ, however, is that Malcolm X is arguing for kind of more immediate action. He's arguing for a kind of more what we call militancy of creating these communities of blacks that stick to themselves, that fight for themselves. And this is where we get the rise of the Black Power movement. It's a response against Martin Luther King Jr. So second question: in what ways do Malcolm X and MLK differ in their approach to civil rights? Um, you know, so like to kind of go back to it, it's that Martin Luther King is I don't know any other better word other than martyr. I mean, a martyr is someone who dies for a cause, and usually we talk about that cause being good. And I think this is very much a good cause. And so Martin Luther King Jr. dying for civil rights, um, he did. I mean, Malcolm X doesn't really get anything passed. Malcolm X is not worried about the government. I mean, he is. He's very much concerned, but he's not. He doesn't push for legislation. Malcolm X is a kind of cynic in this regard, right? So Malcolm X is he kind of wants to, make his own little communities and keep them sheltered from whites. Whereas Martin Luther King is going to say that that's an impossibility. We are all in one society, whether we like it or not, and we're going to have to work to fight to make it a true society. So the dream is referring to here. He's not talking about blacks being, he's not talking about blacks having rights. He is, but he's more fundamentally talking about a society. He says, I have a dream of a society where whites and blacks can live together, where white and black children can live together. So very important here, the dream is a dream of a society. This is more of a dream for a community, a smaller community. This is a dream for a nation which is at peace with itself, at peace with its conscience, right? So the argument for Martin Luther King Jr. is that he has a much broader vision, one that is going to have to change. I mean, if you want to change the entire body, you're going to have to change the soul. This is just trying to create two separate organisms, they kind of bustle up against each other, but are ultimately separate. Whereas Martin Luther King is arguing more for a kind of radical integration that's going to take a change of soul, a change of the American mind. And so here's the question. In what ways do Malcolm X and MLK differ in their approach to civil rights? I don't want you to tell me what they did. I want you to tell me how is their philosophies different. What is the philosophy MLK is working with, and what's the philosophy that Malcolm X is working with? That is the second question. And then, so we're going to go down, yada, yada, yada. Okay. In any case, MLK is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And it just creates this period of mourning. On April 4th, 1968, he's assassinated in Tennessee. So he actually was getting tired of Vietnam, and he's kind of, you can see MLK becoming more cynical towards the end of his life. And here's the thing. I mean, because MLK and Malcolm X are fighting, it starts to fragment. So the solidarity of the bus boycotts, that's what made it so successful. We start to see it kind of slipping here in the late 60s. And MLK was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. So third question, when and where was MLK assassinated? Third question, when and where was MLK assassinated? So I think that's going to be about it for this lecture. We will pick back up on Thursday. So you need to answer these questions, just complete sentences. Obviously, the more thorough, the more sentences you write, the easier it is to get your points. This is not going to be a lot of points. I mean, these kind of points are maybe like 10 points a day, but I mean, that adds up. I mean, we're talking about potentially 15 or more school days or more. We're talking about 150 points that if you don't do these, I mean, that you're going to be seriously behind. So make sure you get those done. If you need to, go back and watch the video to hear the questions or pause it, whatever you want to do. But in any case, let's see how this works. And I hope you have a very, very good, it's safe, not break, but a very good and safe kind of weird situation we're in. All right. See y'all later.